Hi, Rod Kane, Washington Grand Company here, and I'm here to talk to you again about my favorite Ancients Medieval rule set, Triumph. Question came up, first of all, why am I painting miniatures and not doing more videos? But that's not really the point. The real question was, what would you guys like to see videos on? And the guy mentioned on the line that he'd like to see something about flank marches. So today we're going to talk about flank marches a little bit. Good idea or bad idea? So, in the rule system, a flank march is when you designate a certain portion of your force to come in off the side edge of the table potentially. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on the miniatures and I'm going to describe how you can get how your army qualifies for a flank march, and then how you can execute a flank march, and then we'll talk a little bit about whether a flank march is a good idea or a bad idea. The suggestion online was to throw some Romans and Parthians on the table, so I have a Parthian army full of cataphracts and horsebow, and a Roman army full of basically legionnaires, so slow-moving foot army versus a much more mobile army. So we'll zoom in on the miniatures and we'll talk a little bit more about flank marches, and hopefully you'll stay with me and we'll watch the video. Okay, so we're going to do our bird's eye view of the battlefield. I set up a typical play area for a 48-point 15mm army. And we have three pieces of terrain. We've got some woods and a village. We have our Roman army, our Parthian army. And in the Parthian army, we're going to designate a flank march. So who can flank march in your army? And when can you flank march? So flank marches really apply to when you have a typical 48 point versus 48 point sit down and play head-to-head match, and you're using the maneuver and the invasion rolls to determine how you set up the terrain and what topography you're playing on. As you can see, I still have my winter board out here because I haven't made any new boards for the summer, and quite frankly I had this one out already. So the Romans are fighting in the snow in arable territory versus the Parthians. So how do you get to do a flank march? Any army can do a flank march if they roll below their maneuver rating for their army. So armies that are more maneuverable have higher maneuver ratings. Their chances to do a flank march are much higher. Their chances to win the terrain are much higher. So the maneuver rating can be quite an advantage in setting up the board and the ability to do a flank march. Any army that rolls a 1 can also do a flank march. So the Parthians, fairly high maneuver rating. Chances are they can do flank marches, maybe 50% of the battles. So what troops can they send in a flank march? They can send 16 points of the army. So if you're Parthians, one of your most likely candidates for flank march would be, let's say, your horsebow, because they're fast and they can come in off of the flank pretty quickly. They're fairly effective troops. Your flank march can include your general or not. So you could use the cataphract general. The problem with that is that the cataphract general is very slow. And flank marches, as we'll talk about a little bit, will create a command control problem. If the general is with the flank march, chances are, let's say they come in on this side over here, the rest of the army is going to be out of command control. Same problem works against the flank march, because if the flank march consists of 4 horsebow and the general is in the main army, the guys coming in off the flank are probably out of command control. So one of the cons to doing flank march is a loss of command control. You can use an allied contingent for the flank march, but if you use an allied contingent, the entire allied contingent must be the flank march. You can't have some of your allies in the main body and some in the flank march. You have to have them all in one or the other. You don't have to use all 4 elements here. You could use 4 points. It's up to 16 points, but you could use fewer than 16 points. You can't have an elephant, an artillery piece, or a war wagon in a flank march. Not very historically accurate that they flank march with those anyway, and they're also pretty ineffective as flank marchers. So what would you do, or how do you deploy a flank march? The way it works, first of all, we've deployed our terrain and we've deployed our army. So our battle line troops are in the center. Troops that can go on the flank are on the flank. Here for the Romans, you've got some Lightfoot in the woods, and you've reserved the flank marchers. So the the flank march is not a secret. We reserve the flank march. We know that these guys are coming in as a flank march. On the Parthians' first turn, with one command pip, they have to bring the flank marchers onto the table. Now, these flank marchers can go on either flank, or if you change your mind, you could also put them on your base edge, anywhere along your base edge. So the Parthians could have them come from their base edge if they decided not to flank march based on the Roman deployment, or they can bring them on either flank. If there are two flank marches, the first flank march will deploy, and if it deploys on one of the board edges, the second flank march has to deploy on the other board edge or their own base edge. They cannot deploy on the same board edge. You have to deploy as a group, and you have to be within 4 MU of the board edge. So we'll use our gauge here, and we can place them on the flank. They have to be within 4. They have to be in a contiguous group. However, they also have to be 4 from any enemy. So this Lightfoot, not in the way. We could place them right there, for example. Okay, they're not within 4 of an enemy. They're within 4 of the base edge. That is a deployment. So on the Parthians' first turn, they'd roll for pips. They'd use one of those pips to deploy the flank march. If they do not deploy the flank march on marchers on the first turn, they are not going to be in the game, and they don't count as lost, but you will now be playing with a much smaller army. So you want to deploy those flank marchers on the first turn. Mounted closed order foot cannot deploy in a flank march into difficult terrain or rough terrain. So we could not deploy these horsebow into a woods if there was a woods close to the edge of the board. You can do it with open order foot, but not with the mounted and not with the closed order foot. So those are kind of the rules for deploying a flank march. Now the question, one of the questions came up, well, how do you win with, or how do you, should you do a flank march? Well, that's a tough question. I would argue that it depends a lot on the terrain. It depends a lot on the army that you're facing and the army you're fighting with. So, in general, these horsebow are very good units to use for flank march because they move so fast that you can see within 2 movements, they're right into the Roman battle line. However, they're awful far away from their general. Okay, there's a woods in the way, so even if the general was here, even if this line advances to this point, and you notice that the general's scooted this way because we were anticipating flank march on the side, they're still out of command because of the line of sight. So until they get past that woods, they'll take 2 pips to move this group, or if you want to reform them, even more. And quite frankly, putting pressure on the Roman flank with 4 horsebow sounds really great if they've also got pressure on the front. So you need these lines to come in and put pressure on both the front and the flank of the Romans at the same time. Otherwise, the Romans could turn and respond to the horsebow and possibly, push them off the board or overwhelm them with numbers. And you've got a Lightfoot here in the woods that come out and lock on flanks. So why would this be a good potential move for the Parthians? Well, they're slow. They've only got 1 mounted. The infantry are only moving 3. These guys are moving faster at 5, but they can't take them on in the open by themselves. So in this particular situation, you analyze it, you look, well, the horsebow don't have a lot of room to maneuver, but they do have a nice clear channel here. So I would say go for it, but make sure that the front is pressured when you bring them in. If you bring them in by themselves and they're too far away, they might get chopped up. The one thing you got going for you is that this Roman army is not very maneuverable, so it's not going to be able to respond, but it does have reserves, and it can take these reserves, turn them over here, and try to deal with the flank march while holding off the main line. So flank marches can be very powerful in that you've already got units, you could have taken these same horsebow and you could have rode them around these woods anyway, but now on turn 1, they're already here and threatening the flank. So it can be very powerful. But keep in mind too, this represents 16 points. 16 points lost is end of the battle. So I would suggest that you play around with flank marches, you give them a try. They can be extremely good ways to win the battle, and they can also be extremely good ways to lose the battle. But give it a try. If you got a very mobile army versus a not so mobile army, I definitely think that flank marches are worth checking out. Anyway, I hope that gives you a little bit better explanation of how they work and how you deploy them. My name's Rod Kane. This game's called Triumph, and I want to thank you for watching.